In a dimly lit attic, Leonard Mathers sat before a centuries-old mirror he'd inherited, his trembling hands clutching a letter his late daughter, Eliza, had written before her untimely death. Desperate to reconnect, he'd read about an ancient ritual to contact lost loved ones through mirrors. But as Leonard began to chant, a flicker of motion caught his eye. Something shifted behind the glass. Eliza's face never appeared. Instead, something older, darker, and patient was looking back. Leonard Mathers' life had shrunk to the confines of his dimly lit study, a room filled with the scent of old wood and forgotten time. The antique mirror now dominated the space, its heavy, ornate frame etched with patterns that seemed alive when caught in the right light. Leonard had not intended to buy the mirror, nor had he gone looking for it. Yet it had found him, as though it had waited for someone desperate enough to invite it into their home. It began a week after Eliza's funeral, when the grief of losing his only daughter had grown unbearable. She had been the last piece of his world. His wife, Meredith, had succumbed to illness years earlier, and now the silence of the house was deafening. Leonard spent days wandering the rooms, trailing his fingers along her untouched belongings and weeping over memories. The finality of death was too cruel, and he clung to the irrational hope that there was still a way to reach her. The auction house had been a relic itself, tucked into a forgotten corner of the city. Leonard had stumbled upon it by accident, or so he thought. Inside, the air was thick with the weight of history. Ancient furniture, faded paintings, and peculiar objects filled the space. It was then that the mirror caught his eye. It leaned against the far wall, larger than life and yet almost unnoticeable at first glance. The frame, blackened with age, was carved with serpentine patterns that twisted and curled, ending in jagged edges. Its glass was slightly warped, as though it held more than mere reflections. As Leonard approached, a strange sensation prickled his skin, a coldness that seemed to seep from the mirror itself. The auctioneer, a gaunt man with a thin smile, seemed surprised when Leonard pointed to the mirror. "That old thing?" he asked almost mockingly. "It's been here for decades. No one's ever wanted it. Are you sure?" Leonard nodded, unable to explain the pull it had over him. The auctioneer's smile deepened, though his eyes reflected something colder. "It's yours, then. Take care of it." The mirror arrived the next day, delivered by a man who refused to step foot inside Leonard's house. He left it on the porch without a word and hurried back to his truck. Leonard ignored the odd behavior, too consumed by his own anticipation. He dragged the mirror inside, marveling at its weight and presence. Once in the study, he positioned it against the wall opposite his desk. The house felt different with it there, as though it had shifted into something older, something foreign. Days passed, and Leonard found himself drawn to the mirror more often than he cared to admit. He caught himself staring at it, his own reflection seeming less familiar each time. He began to notice peculiarities. The frame, for one, seemed to change when he wasn't looking directly at it. The patterns carved into the wood appeared to writhe and twist in his peripheral vision. At first, he thought it was his grief playing tricks on him, but soon he started hearing the whispers again. They were faint, almost indistinguishable from the creaks of the old house, but they were there, and they were growing louder. Leonard turned to books and the internet, searching for explanations. He read about the ancient belief that mirrors were portals to other realms, gateways through which spirits could communicate. Some cultures covered mirrors during mourning, fearing they could trap the soul of the deceased. Leonard latched onto the idea, convinced the mirror was a gift rather than a curse. If such things were possible, then perhaps he could reach Eliza. One night, unable to resist, Leonard lit a circle of candles around the mirror. He had read somewhere that fire could act as a bridge between worlds. With trembling hands, he placed Eliza's favorite stuffed animal, a worn, gray rabbit, at the base of the mirror. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice cracking. "If you're here, if you can hear me, please show me a sign." The air in the room seemed to shift. The candle flames flickered wildly, though no windows were open. Leonard's breath caught as the whispers returned, louder this time. His reflection in the mirror seemed off. It moved in sync with him, but its eyes carried a depth that wasn't his own. For a moment he thought he saw something else in the glass, a shadow darker than the room behind him. Desperate for answers, Leonard began keeping a journal of his interactions with the mirror. He wrote about the nights when the mirror seemed to hum, a low vibration that resonated in his bones. He wrote about the growing unease that crept into his dreams, vivid nightmares of being pulled into the mirror's depths. One evening, as Leonard prepared for another attempt to contact Eliza, the whispers grew louder than ever before. A guttural voice emerged, speaking in a language Leonard didn't recognize. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, the air thickening until it was difficult to breathe. Leonard froze, staring at his reflection. His mirrored self smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that sent ice through his veins. Then the whispers stopped, and the room fell silent. Leonard collapsed to the floor, trembling. For the first time, he questioned whether the mirror was truly a gift, or if he had invited something far darker into his home. Leonard Mathers' life had become a labyrinth of silence, broken only by the whispers that trailed him at every turn. Though he tried to ignore the mirror, the pull it exerted was impossible to resist. The whispers, faint at first, were growing bolder, forming words he couldn't understand, calling him closer to the study he had tried to seal off. Sleep offered no reprieve, as his dreams turned vivid and cruel, replaying Eliza's face in the mirror, twisting into something grotesque. Desperate for answers, Leonard reached out to Victor Graves, a historian and old friend with a penchant for the strange. Over the years, Victor had built a reputation as an expert on artifacts steeped in legend and folklore. Leonard explained the situation, omitting the whispers and the strange occurrences. "It's just a mirror," he lied, his voice trembling, "but something about it feels wrong." When Victor arrived, his easygoing demeanor vanished the moment he saw the mirror. He approached it cautiously, running his hand along the carved frame without touching the glass. "Leonard," he said, his voice low, "do you have any idea what this is?" "It's just an antique," Leonard replied, though his heart pounded. Victor shook his head. "This isn't just an antique. It's old, older than you think, and it's not safe." He explained that mirrors in folklore were often believed to be gateways, not only to the dead, but to other realms. "Some mirrors were tools," he said. "Others were traps. They lure the grieving, the desperate. They promise answers, but they only take." Leonard's throat tightened. "Take what?" Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. "It's not what they take. It's what they let in." That night, Leonard couldn't shake Victor's words. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the whispers growing louder with every passing hour. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were voices, fragmented and urgent. One, soft and trembling, stood out from the rest. "Daddy." He shot upright, his heart racing. It was Eliza. He was certain of it. Against his better judgment, he unlocked the study door and stepped inside. The room was unnaturally cold, the air heavy with an oppressive weight. The mirror stood at the center, its glass shimmering faintly. Leonard lit a single candle, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Eliza," he whispered, stepping closer. "If you're here, give me a sign." The candle flickered violently, its flame stretching toward the mirror. The glass rippled like water, and for a fleeting moment Eliza's face appeared. She looked just as he remembered, her expression soft and filled with sorrow. "Daddy," her voice echoed, faint but unmistakable. Tears blurred Leonard's vision. "Eliza, I'm here. I'll do anything to bring you back." Her lips moved, but the words were inaudible. Leonard leaned closer, pressing his palm against the glass. It was cold, unnaturally so. Suddenly, her face twisted, her eyes darkening and her mouth stretching into a scream. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar, and shadows began to swirl behind her. Leonard stumbled backward, clutching his chest as the candle went out. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the mirror. The shadows within coalesced into a form, tall, jagged, and monstrous. It leaned closer to the glass, its hollow eyes locking onto Leonard's. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The mirror's surface smooth and still. The next morning, Leonard woke on the study floor, his body trembling. He needed answers. Grabbing his coat, he rushed to Victor's home. The door was ajar, and an eerie silence greeted him as he stepped inside. "Victor?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty house. He found Victor in his study, slumped over his desk. Scattered papers surrounded him, filled with sketches of the mirror and hastily scrawled notes. Leonard's stomach turned as he realized Victor wasn't breathing. His friend's face was frozen in an expression of terror, his wide eyes staring at nothing. Among the papers was a single note, written in shaky handwriting. "It's not her. Destroy it." Leonard stumbled out of the house, the note clutched in his hand. The words burned in his mind, battling against the whispers that had followed him back home. "It's not her." He stood before the mirror, the note trembling in his grasp. Could Victor be wrong? What if it really was Eliza? What if she needed him? That night, Leonard returned to the study. The whispers had grown louder, forming words he still couldn't decipher. But Eliza's voice cut through the chaos, clear and desperate. "Daddy, help me." The glass rippled once more, and her face appeared. But this time, the shadows didn't wait. They surged forward, their dark forms crashing against the glass. The mirror shattered outward, shards slicing through the air. Leonard screamed as he was thrown back, his body hitting the wall. When he opened his eyes, the mirror was whole again, its surface unbroken. But the whispers didn't stop. Leonard spent the following days on edge, his nerves frayed and his mind in turmoil. The mirror loomed over him like a specter, its silent presence suffocating. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The groaning of old floorboards, the rustling of leaves against the windows, and the whispers. Always the whispers, growing louder as though they were learning to speak. Victor's note haunted him. "It's not her. Destroy it." But how could he? The thought of obliterating the one thing that might reconnect him with Eliza was unbearable. What if Victor had been wrong? What if the mirror truly was a bridge to her, and not the trap Victor had warned of? The questions clawed at Leonard's mind, each more desperate than the last. One night, unable to bear the weight of his thoughts, Leonard sat in front of the mirror. He brought with him the few remaining items that had belonged to Eliza: her favorite stuffed rabbit, a locket she'd worn as a child, and a photo of the two of them at the beach. He placed them carefully at the base of the mirror and lit the candles that had melted into strange shapes during his previous attempts. "I need to know," Leonard whispered, his voice trembling. "Eliza, if you're here, if you can hear me, please, I need you." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the eardrums and made the heart pound harder. The flames of the candles flickered wildly, their light casting jagged shadows that danced along the walls. Leonard's breath hitched as the glass rippled again, and the whispers surged forward, a cacophony of unintelligible voices. Then one voice broke through the noise, soft, familiar, and achingly sweet. "Daddy." Tears spilled down Leonard's cheeks. "Eliza," he choked, leaning closer to the glass. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'll do anything to bring you back." Her face appeared, radiant and filled with sorrow. "I'm trapped," she said, her voice quivering. "It's so dark, Daddy. Please, help me." Leonard pressed his hand against the glass, the cold seeping into his palm. "Tell me what to do. I'll do anything." The shadows in the mirror shifted, parting to reveal a figure standing behind Eliza. It was tall and indistinct, its form flickering like a dying flame, its eyes, hollow and glowing faintly, locked onto Leonard's. A voice that didn't belong to Eliza spoke, deep and resonant, shaking the very air in the room. "You want her back," it said, each word deliberate and heavy. Leonard recoiled but didn't move away from the mirror. What are you?" The figure tilted its head, the movement unnatural and slow. "I am the keeper of this place," it said, "and I can give her to you for a price." Leonard's heart raced. What price? The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it reached out, its shadowed hand touching Eliza's shoulder. She flinched, her expression turning to one of terror. "No," she cried, her voice breaking. "Daddy, don't listen to it." Leonard's resolve faltered. "Eliza, You want her back," the figure repeated, its voice cutting through Leonard's hesitation. "You need only give what you no longer need." "What does that mean?" Leonard demanded, his voice rising. The figure leaned closer to the glass, its hollow eyes filling Leonard's vision. "Your reflection," it said simply. Leonard blinked, confusion washing over him. "My reflection?" The figure nodded. "Your reflection, your image in the world. Give it to me, and I will give you her." Leonard hesitated, his thoughts racing. The concept was absurd. How could someone give up their reflection? But the promise of having Eliza back, it was too tempting to dismiss outright. "And she'll be safe? Whole?" "She will be yours," the figure replied. "But be warned, once the bargain is made, it cannot be undone." Eliza's voice cut through the tension, desperate and pleading. "Daddy, no, don't do it. It's not me. It's lying." Leonard froze, torn between her words and the overwhelming pull of the promise before him. "How do I know you'll keep your end of the deal?" he asked, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing Eliza fully. She reached out toward the glass, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Daddy," she whispered. "I want to come home." The sight shattered Leonard's resolve. He pressed both hands against the glass, his tears falling freely. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely audible. "Take it. Take my reflection." The figure extended its shadowed hand toward the glass. The room seemed to darken, the candle flames shrinking to pinpricks of light. Leonard felt a coldness seep into his body, deeper than the touch of the glass. His reflection began to shimmer, detaching from his movements. It smiled, an unnatural, twisted smile, as it stepped forward, merging with the figure in the mirror. Leonard collapsed to the floor as the glass went still. The room was silent, save for his ragged breathing. When he looked up, Eliza stood before him, whole and radiant, her eyes filled with tears. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. Leonard reached out, pulling her into his arms. The warmth of her body, the smell of her hair. It was real. She was real. He wept, clutching her tightly, overwhelmed with relief. But in the corner of the mirror, his reflection remained, its hollow eyes watching him with a sinister grin. For the first time in what felt like years, Leonard found himself smiling. Eliza was back. Her laughter filled the house, her footsteps echoed through the halls, and for a brief moment, life felt whole again. She was everything he remembered, soft-spoken, wide-eyed, and radiant. Yet something about her wasn't quite right. At first, Leonard dismissed the feeling as the lingering trauma of grief. But as days turned to weeks, his unease grew. Eliza rarely left his sight, shadowing him wherever he went. She spoke less, her gaze often distant, as though she were watching something he couldn't see. She seemed almost too perfect, like an actor playing a role she didn't quite understand. One evening, as Leonard prepared dinner, he felt her presence behind him. Turning, he found her standing in the doorway, her face blank. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Daddy," she said, her voice oddly flat. Leonard's heart sank, but he said nothing. As the days passed, her odd behavior became harder to ignore. She moved with unsettling fluidity, appearing and disappearing silently. At night, he would wake to find her standing in the shadows, watching him. The joy he'd felt at her return began to twist into something darker, a gnawing fear that he couldn't explain. One night, Leonard awoke to the sensation of being watched. He sat up, his breath catching as he saw Eliza at the foot of his bed. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice distant. Leonard's pulse raced. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room. Leonard followed, finding her in the study, standing before the mirror. Its glass shimmered faintly, the surface rippling like disturbed water. "Eliza," he said, his voice trembling, "what are you doing?" She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, "for bringing me back." Before Leonard could answer, the whispers returned, louder than ever. The room darkened, shadows stretching and writhing across the walls. The mirror rippled violently, and the distorted reflection of the room twisted into grotesque shapes. "Eliza, step away from the mirror," Leonard said, his voice firm. But she didn't move. Instead, she pressed her hand against the glass. The whispers exploded into a deafening roar. Leonard stumbled back as the shadows coalesced within the mirror. The figure from before emerged, its hollow eyes locking on to Leonard. "You took what wasn't yours," it said, its voice reverberating through the room. "And now, you must pay." The figure's shadowy hand reached out, grabbing Eliza and pulling her toward the glass. "No!" Leonard screamed, lunging forward. He grabbed her arm, pulling with all his strength as the force dragged her away. "Daddy, help me!" Eliza cried. Leonard's muscles burned as he yanked her free, both of them tumbling to the floor. The figure snarled, retreating into the mirror as the surface went still. Eliza sobbed in his arms, trembling. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," Leonard said, holding her tightly. But his gaze drifted to the mirror. His reflection was gone. In the days that followed, the house changed. The air grew heavy, the whispers constant. Eliza, too, had changed. She rarely spoke, her once bright eyes dull. She stared out the window for hours, her expression vacant. Leonard could feel the tension in the air, as though something unseen lingered just beyond his reach. One evening, Eliza approached Leonard. "Daddy," she said quietly, "I don't feel right." Leonard knelt before her. "What do you mean?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't think I'm supposed to be here." The words sent a chill down Leonard's spine. "Don't say that. You belong here." She shook her head, tears spilling over. "The shadows. They won't leave me alone. They follow me, even when you're not looking." Leonard's hands tightened on her shoulders. "I'll make them stop. I'll fix this. I promise." That night, as Eliza slept, Leonard returned to the study. The mirror stood silent, but the whispers grew louder as he approached. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice breaking. The glass rippled, the figure emerging once more. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly. "You disrupted the balance. She does not belong here." "Then take me instead," Leonard pleaded. "Let her stay." The figure tilted its head. "The debt must be paid. The living cannot bargain for the dead." Leonard's fists clenched. "I gave you what you wanted. You took my reflection. Isn't that enough?" The figure's voice deepened, resonating with finality. "The reflection was only the beginning. The balance is undone." The shadows surged forward, the glass shattering outward. Leonard shielded his face as shards rained down. When he looked up, the mirror was whole again, its surface smooth. But the whispers didn't stop. The house was no longer a home. It had become a cage, suffused with an oppressive weight that Leonard couldn't shake. The whispers were relentless now, an ever-present murmur that ebbed and surged like the tide, pulling him closer to the brink of madness. Eliza, once the light of his life, had grown eerily silent. She wandered the halls aimlessly, her steps soundless, her expression vacant. Leonard was breaking, piece by piece. He had sacrificed everything for her return, his peace, his sanity, his very reflection, and yet he felt farther from her than ever. The shadows in the house seemed to stretch longer, darker, creeping closer whenever his back was turned. And the mirror. The mirror was no longer just an object. It felt alive, a sentient force that watched him, judged him, waited for him. One night, as Leonard sat in the study, his head in his hands, Eliza appeared in the doorway. She was pale, her eyes rimmed with dark circles, and her small hands trembled at her sides. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Leonard looked up, his heart breaking at the sight of her. "What is it, sweetheart?" Tears filled her eyes. "I don't want to be here anymore." The words hit him like a hammer. He rose from his chair, crossing the room to kneel before her. "Don't say that," he said, his voice cracking. "You're safe here. You're with me." Eliza shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "The shadows. They're always there. I hear them calling. They want me to go back." Leonard's breath caught. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she sobbed against his chest. "I won't let them take you," he whispered. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep you here." That night, Leonard resolved to confront the mirror once and for all. He waited until Eliza had fallen asleep, then returned to the study. The whispers grew louder as he approached, their tone mocking, accusatory. The glass rippled as though anticipating his arrival, the shadows within writhing like living things. "I know you're there," Leonard said, his voice trembling but determined. "Show yourself." The figure emerged from the darkness, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. "You have come to bargain again," it said, its voice low and resonant. Leonard's fists clenched at his sides. "What do you want from me? Haven't I given you enough?" The figure tilted its head, its expressionless face unreadable. "The balance has been broken. The living and the dead cannot coexist. She must return." "No," Leonard said, his voice firm. "She stays. Take me instead." The figure was silent for a moment, as though considering his words. Then it spoke. "A life for a life. The door will open, but it cannot close again." Leonard's heart pounded. What does that mean? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing a portal within the mirror. The glass shimmered, its surface dissolving into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. Leonard stared into the depths, his breath hitching as he saw glimpses of another world. Dark, vast, and teeming with shapes that defied understanding. Eliza's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and trembling. "Daddy?" Leonard turned to see her standing in the doorway, her small frame bathed in the faint glow of the mirror. "Go back to bed, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This doesn't concern you." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't want you to go." Leonard knelt before her, his hands cupping her face. "I have to, Eliza. It's the only way to keep you safe." She shook her head, her tears spilling over. "Please don't leave me." Leonard's resolve wavered, but he forced himself to stand. He turned to the mirror, his reflection absent, the vortex swirling hungrily. The figure watched him, silently, its hollow eyes gleaming with something akin to satisfaction. "What happens if I go through?" Leonard asked, his voice trembling. The figure's voice was cold, devoid of sympathy. "You will take her place. The balance will be restored." Leonard glanced back at Eliza, her tear-streaked face breaking his heart. "Will she be free? Will she be safe?" "She will be as she was," the figure replied. "But you will belong to me." Leonard closed his eyes, taking a shuddering breath. He had made his decision the moment he saw Eliza in pain. Without another word, he stepped toward the mirror. The air grew colder with each step, the whispers rising to a crescendo. As he reached the edge of the vortex, he turned to Eliza one last time. "I love you, sweetheart," he said, his voice breaking. "Never forget that." "Daddy!" Eliza screamed, running toward him. But before she could reach him, Leonard stepped into the mirror. The vortex closed around him, the whispers falling silent. The room was still. The mirror's surface returned to its smooth, unbroken state, reflecting nothing but the empty study. Eliza fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Come back." But Leonard was gone. Eliza's cries echoed through the house, her small frame trembling as she clung to the edge of the mirror. "Daddy, come back, please," she screamed, pounding her fists against the cold glass. But the mirror stayed silent, its surface smooth and unyielding. The whispers were gone, leaving only an oppressive stillness that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. Hours passed before Eliza slumped to the floor, her tears spent. The house was eerily still, the silence heavy and suffocating. Shivering, she wrapped her arms around herself. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm scared." She stayed in the study, her gaze fixed on the mirror. Days blurred together, marked only by the shifting light through the windows. Eliza ate little and slept even less, waiting for any sign of her father, but the mirror refused to yield its secrets, as if mocking her desperation with its lifeless surface. On the third night, the silence broke. A faint hum filled the room, and the glass began to ripple like water. Eliza sat up, her heart racing. "Daddy?" she whispered. A shadow moved within the mirror, growing larger. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw her father's face. But as the figure emerged, Eliza's hope faltered. It wasn't Leonard. The figure was tall and gaunt, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. It tilted its head, studying her. Eliza pressed her back against the wall. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it extended a shadowy hand, beckoning her. Eliza shook her head. "I'm not going with you," she said firmly, though her body trembled. The figure hesitated, then dissolved back into the glass. The whispers faded, leaving her alone once more, but the encounter ignited a spark of determination. If her father had gone into the mirror to save her, she would find a way to bring him back. Eliza searched the house, combing through Leonard's belongings for answers. She found his journal, its pages filled with notes on the mirror's strange behavior. One entry stood out. "The mirror is a doorway, but also a trap. It gives, but it takes more. Fire and shadow hold the key." Taking a deep breath, Eliza gathered candles, matches, and a piece of Leonard's clothing. She arranged them around the mirror as Leonard's notes described. Lighting the candles, she knelt before the glass. "Daddy, if you can hear me, I'm coming to get you." The room grew colder, the candle flames flickering wildly. The mirror darkened, its surface rippling like ink. Fear clawed at her, but she forced herself to stand. "I'm not leaving without you," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. As she reached out, shadows surged from the glass, swirling around her. Eliza screamed as the room vanished, replaced by a desolate landscape shrouded in mist. The ground was cold beneath her feet, the air thick and heavy. The silence pressed against her, amplifying every breath and heartbeat. "Daddy?" she called, her voice echoing. A faint light flickered in the distance. She ran toward it, her legs trembling. The light grew brighter, revealing Leonard slumped against a jagged rock. "Daddy!" she cried. Leonard looked up, his face pale and drawn. "Eliza," he whispered, "you shouldn't be here." She threw her arms around him, sobbing. "I had to come. I couldn't leave you." Leonard held her tightly. "You need to go back," he said, his voice breaking. This place isn't for you." "I'm not leaving without you," Eliza said. "We can go together." Leonard shook his head. "The mirror only lets one go free." Tears streamed down Eliza's face. "Then take my place. Let me stay." "No," Leonard said firmly. "I won't let you." The shadows began to close in, shifting and writhing. Leonard cupped Eliza's face. "When the mirror opens, you run. Don't look back. Do you understand?" Eliza shook her head, her tears falling faster. "I won't leave you." "You have to," Leonard said, his voice trembling. "It's the only way." The light around them grew brighter. Leonard pushed Eliza toward it. "Go, Eliza, now!" Eliza stumbled toward the light, her heart breaking. As she reached the edge of the vortex, she turned back. Leonard stood in the shadows, his form fading. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. "I love you too," Leonard said, his voice steady. "Always." The vortex closed around her, the light swallowing her whole. When Eliza opened her eyes, she was back in the study, the mirror smooth and silent. She fell to her knees, sobbing. Leonard was gone. Placing a hand against the mirror, she whispered, "I'll never forget you, Daddy. I promise." The house was quiet, but in the stillness, Eliza swore she could feel her father's presence, watching over her from the other side of the glass. She stood there for hours, her hand pressed against the cold surface, whispering promises to herself that she would keep his memory alive, no matter what. Deep within the mirror, Leonard lingered, his love for her eternal. Though he was bound to the darkness, he knew his sacrifice had set her free.